I buried my brother on a Thursday. By 2 o'clock, his house was full of people and my house was full of food nobody asked for. Casserole dishes lined every counter. Folding chairs appeared in the living room, the way they always do when somebody dies. Quietly, without explanation, as if grief comes with furniture. I moved through it all like I was walking through water. Voices reached me slow. Hands touched my arm and I felt them a second after they landed. I heard my name spoken so many times it stopped sounding like mine. My name is Adeline Tyron. And the day I buried my brother Harlan was the day life split into two halves. Everything before that phone call and everything after. Simone and Dwayne stayed the whole afternoon. My daughter worked that room the way she works everything, efficiently, warmly, with both hands. She refilled plates. She accepted condolences on my behalf when I went quiet. She touched shoulders and lowered her voice at the right moments. From the outside, she looked like exactly what a daughter should be. I was too tired to think about what she looked like from the inside. When the last neighbor left and the door closed, the silence came down fast. Simone was in the kitchen running water. Dwayne sat at the table with his phone. I stood in the hallway and let the quiet settle around me. Then something moved through the grief. Something I hadn't let myself touch all day. 3 days before the funeral, Harlan's attorney had called me to a private reading. Just me. What he told me in that room. The mansion in Oak Ridge, the trust, the $120 million Harlan had built and structured and left entirely in my name. I had held it alone since that morning because I didn't know what else to do with it. It felt too large for the inside of my chest. But standing in that hallway, I thought, Simone should know. This is the one thing today that isn't loss. This is something I can give her that isn't grief. I walked toward the kitchen. I could see the back of her head, hear the low sound she was humming. I was close enough to touch the door frame. My mouth was already opening. My phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I stepped back into the hallway and answered. The voice was calm, unhurried, precise. This is Dexter Holt. I handled your brother's estate matters. I need you to hear me carefully. Please do not discuss the inheritance with your daughter yet. Not tonight. Not until we've spoken. Your brother believed there was a possibility this conversation might become necessary one day, and he trusted me to have it with you personally. I need you to come to my office. Alone. I stood perfectly still. Simone was 10 feet away, back turned, water still running. I asked him why he couldn't explain over the phone. He said he didn't know who was in the room with me. He said some conversations had to happen face to face. He said he needed my word that I would say nothing until we spoke. Something in his voice stopped me from asking anything else. It wasn't urgency. It was certainty. The kind that belongs to a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and knows exactly when to put it down. I gave him my word. I walked into the kitchen. Simone looked up and asked who called. I told her it was the funeral home, following up on arrangements. She nodded and handed me a dish towel. If you are watching this, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know where this story is reaching. I dried a glass I didn't remember picking up. Behind me, Simone hummed that low sound again. I had just lied to my daughter for the first time in my life, and I still didn't know why. They came with food. That was the first thing. The containers stacked in Dwayne's arms. The smell of something warm filling my hallway before they were even fully through the door. Simone kissed my cheek and steered me toward my own chair like I was a guest in my house. Dwayne moved quietly to the kitchen, opening cabinets he'd been in 100 times, putting things away without being asked. It looked like love. It was designed to. 2 days had passed since the funeral, and I was still moving like something inside me had come loose. Dishes sat until midday. I returned calls in the evening when I had enough voice for it. Sleep came in pieces and left the same way. The house had a new kind of quiet in it, not the peaceful kind, the kind that presses. Simone sat close. She asked how I'd slept, whether I'd eaten, whether Sister Caldwell from the church had come by like she promised. Her voice was careful and soft, the way you speak to someone you're worried about. She held my hand twice without being asked. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, unhurried, present. I felt myself settling slightly, not into comfort, but into the familiar shape of my daughter sitting across from me. Then Dwayne reached for the folder he'd set by the door when they came in. He placed it on the table without a word. Simone leaned forward just slightly. Mama, we've been thinking. Her voice didn't change, still warm, still careful. With Uncle Harlan gone, you don't have anyone watching over things the way you used to. The properties on Elm Grove and Patterson. We just want to make sure they're protected. Make sure they stay in the family. This document just formalizes that. It's really just about keeping everything safe. She slid the paper across the table toward me. I looked at it. The language was dense and unfamiliar. I found my name. I found the addresses on Elm Grove and Patterson. Everything between those words was architecture I couldn't read. I asked her what kind of document it was exactly. A deed transfer, she said. For protection. Nothing about how you live changes, Mama. It just puts things in the right place legally. I asked if I should have a lawyer look at it first. Something moved across her face. Barely, just a flicker, before the smoothness returned. Of course, if that would make you feel better. But honestly, it's pretty standard. Dwayne already had a colleague review it. It's just paperwork. Dwayne nodded from across the table. He hadn't spoken a single word. I looked down at my hands on the document. They weren't Desi. I told her that. I told her my head wasn't right yet, that I needed to feel like myself before I put my name on anything. Simone's had reached across and covered both my hands with hers. Her grip was warm, firm in a way that held just a moment too long. Take all the time you need. I'll leave it here so you have it when you're ready. She squeezed my hand again at the door. Dwayne touched my shoulder, and then they were gone. I stood at the window and watched the car back out of the driveway. Then I looked at that document on my table. I looked at it the way you look at something you've found in a drawer that has no business being there. Not with panic. With recognition. I picked up my phone and called Dexter Holt. Dexter Holt met me at the door himself. No receptionist. No one else in the waiting area. The office was quiet in the way that told me he had arranged it that way deliberately. He shook my hand, held the door, and closed it behind us without a word about the weather or how I was holding up. I appreciated that more than I could say. He waited until I was settled before he opened the folder. He started with Tyron Holdings, LLC. Harlan had built it over 20 years, a private commercial real estate portfolio, spanning Greensboro, High Point, and Burlington. Properties acquired quietly, leased to institutional tenants, managed through layered holding entities without public profile. Before the portfolio, there was the construction company. Harlan founded it in the late 90s with nothing but a bonding certificate and used equipment. He built it through 3 recessions, sold it in a private transaction 3 years before he died. I asked who he sold it to. Dexter said the buyer required confidentiality as a condition of the sale. Harlan agreed immediately. The proceeds moved into Tyron Holdings the same week the sale closed. No press, no announcement. Harlan's name never appeared publicly in connection with the transaction at all. I asked why he agreed so easily to staying invisible. Dexter looked at me for a moment before he answered. He said, "Because your brother did not want anyone to know the full scope of what he had, not until everything was properly structured and protected." Then he told me about Oak Ridge. The mansion had been held under Tyron Holdings, LLC for 9 years. It carried no personal property record under Harlan's name. A public search for Harlan Tyron in Guilford County returned nothing connected to that address. He kept his personal life running through the modest Greensboro home everyone knew. Oak Ridge was separate, private. He brought Marvell. He brought no one else. Simone had never been there once. I sat with that quietly. Then Dexter folded his hands on the desk and told me the rest. 4 years ago, while I was recovering from knee surgery, Simone had made a move. Not a deed transfer. Something more preliminary. She drafted a power of attorney document framed as temporary help while I was laid up. She presented it as concern. Harlan found out after the bank's compliance department paused the process over irregular execution requirements and contacted one of the existing authorized relationships attached to my accounts and estate documents. Harlan had already been formally listed with the bank for emergency financial coordination during my surgery recovery. That review call reached him directly. He came to Dexter immediately. They handled it quietly. A formal legal revocation, properly documented and preserved before anything could move forward. The document Simone drafted never became active authority over any account or property connected to me. Harlan never told me. He made that choice deliberately. I was recovering. He said to Dexter that giving me that pain on top of everything else served nothing when the threat was already contained. But he documented every detail, and left Dexter with one standing instruction. If anything ever happened to him, call Adeline before she says a word to her daughter. Not because he assumed Simone would move again. Because he knew that without him standing between us, there would be nothing to stop her. The document Simone left on my kitchen table 2 days after funeral was not grief turning into poor judgment. It was a plan that had been waiting for him to die. I drove home alone. I pulled into my driveway and turned the engine off and sat there. I had buried my brother once at the graveside. I buried him again in that office. The man he really was, what he carried, why he never said a single word. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel. I let them. I didn't call ahead. I just drove. The morning after Dexter's office, I found myself on Marvell's Street without fully deciding to go there. I sat in the car for a minute, looking at her front door. Then I got out. She opened it before I knocked. She didn't say anything about that. She just stepped back and let me in and went straight to the kitchen to put the kettle on. That was Marvell. 40 years of friendship, and she still knew what I needed before I could form the words for it. We sat at her kitchen table the way we always have, without arranging ourselves, without preamble. I looked at her face and saw the grief sitting there unguarded, not performed, not managed, real. The kind that doesn't know how to make itself presentable. I asked her how much she knew. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Dexter called me the same evening he called you. Harlan put me in the estate file with written authorization to receive information if something happened to him. He did that 4 years ago, right after the power of attorney situation. She said it plainly, no softening. Then she told me something Harlan never had. She was there the morning I handed him that money. Early in his business, before anything was certain, before anyone outside of us believed he would amount to what he became. She didn't know the full amount until years later, but she saw his face when he opened that envelope. She said it wasn't the money that moved him. It was what the money meant. That someone who had her own struggles, her own losses, her own reasons not to, looked at him and believed anyway. She said he carried that morning for the rest of his life. That everything he built, the holdings, the trust structure, the way he kept my name completely separate from his business, all of it traced back to one decision I made at a kitchen table, not unlike this one. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I didn't. Marvell set her cup down. I need to tell you what the power of attorney situation actually was, not just that it happened. She told me in plain terms. Simone had drafted a document herself. Not forged, but built on a pretext I never authorized. She took it to my bank and presented it as temporary assistance whilst I was recovering from knee surgery. She attempted to add her name to one of my accounts. The bank flagged it because Harlan held a separate account at the same institution. The flag reached Dexter before any transfer occurred. Everything was documented. Harlan kept every page of it. Marvell was quiet for a moment after that. I loved that child. I need you to know I didn't want to know this about her. She looked at me steadily, but I know it. And now you do too. She got up. When she came back, she was holding a small piece of paper. She set it on the table and slid it toward me the same way Simone had slid that deed across my kitchen table 2 days ago. The difference was everything. A name. Marlo Vance, attorney. Office on Elm Street in Greensboro. Harlan found her 3 years ago. He never needed to use her, but he wanted you to have the name if the time ever came. I looked at that piece of paper. Something moved through my chest and settled there. It wasn't grief. It wasn't anger either. It was the first thing I'd felt in days that had any kind of floor to it. I told no one I was going. I found the office on Elm Street on my own, parked on my own, walked through the door on my own. The receptionist offered me water, and I declined. Marlo Vance came out within 2 minutes, compact, precise. The kind of woman who moves like she has already decided where she is going before she stands up. She shook my hand and led me in and closed the door. I gave her the quitclaim deed without explaining much. She took it and read it the way you read something you have seen in many variations over many years. No reaction on her face, no performance of shock. When she looked up, she simply began to explain. She told me exactly what that document would have done. Full legal ownership transfer of both the Elm Grove and Patterson properties. No compensation required. No court involvement. Completely enforceable the moment I signed, and a notary witnessed it. She told me what Simone understood about that instrument that I did not, that it was not a protection document. It was a transfer document. The word protection appeared nowhere in its legal function. It existed only in the way Simone had described it across my kitchen table, she said. The mechanism wasn't force, and it wasn't forgery. It was the space between what your daughter knows professionally and what she expected you not to know at all. That space was the weapon. I sat with that for a moment. Then she told me what could be done. The Elm Grove and Patterson properties needed to move into an irrevocable trust immediately, recorded with the Guilford County Register of Deeds. Once that recording was in place, the quitclaim deeds Simone was holding would become worthless. It would reference an ownership structure that no longer existed. She could not transfer what I no longer held in my personal name. I asked how long it would take. She said 2 to 3 weeks if we moved efficiently. She needed my full availability. She also needed one more thing. She said it without softening it. Do not change anything Simone can see. Return her calls. Stay warm. Do not refuse anything outright. If she senses a shift, she will move faster. Give her nothing. I asked whether Simone might run a title search on the properties before we finished. Marlowe considered that briefly. Then she said, a careful professional would. But your daughter brought that document to your door 2 days after a funeral. She wasn't operating carefully. She was operating fast, on the assumption that you would sign before the week was out. She didn't run a search because she didn't believe she needed to yet. That confidence is going to be the most expensive mistake she ever makes. I authorized the trust preparation and signed the engagement documents before I left. I sat in the car for a moment before I started the engine. Then I drove home and called Simone from my kitchen. I told her I had been looking at the document. My head still wasn't right. I just needed a little more time. She told me to take all the time I needed. Her voice was warm and patient and completely certain. I thanked her and ended the call. I set the phone on the table. The house was quiet. And I understood something I hadn't let myself understand fully until that moment. From here forward, every word I said to my daughter was a performance. I decided I was going to be very good at it. 3 weeks have a way of looking like nothing from the outside. Church on Sundays. Neighbors stopping by with covered dishes I redistributed before they could pile up. Thank you notes written at the kitchen table in the early morning before the day had any demands in it. I moved through all of it steadily, unhurried, like a woman still finding solid ground beneath her feet. That part wasn't entirely performance. Grief doesn't pause because you've made a decision. It runs alongside everything else. Simone came twice. The first visit she brought food and stayed 2 hours. She was warm and domestic, cleared dishes without being asked, refilled my glass, sat close on the sofa the way she did as a girl. The questions came woven into ordinary conversation so smoothly I might have missed them if I hadn't been listening for exactly that. What are you thinking about the Patterson properties, Mama? Managing rentals is a lot, especially right now. Have you thought about whether you want to keep handling that yourself? I told her I hadn't thought much about anything yet, that I was taking it one day at a time. She nodded like that was the right answer. But a few minutes later, she circled back to it indirectly, asking whether tenants had been paying consistently, whether repairs had become stressful lately, whether I still had all the old paperwork organized the way Harlan used to help me keep it. Casual questions. Too casual. The second visit was shorter and more purposeful. She mentioned the document, lightly, no pressure, just checking in. Then she said, Dwayne had been looking at the properties and thinking there might be some updates worth considering. Things that could increase the value significantly. Just something to keep in mind when I was ready to think about next steps. This time there was the smallest shift underneath her patience. Not enough for anyone else to hear it. But I heard it, a faint tightening, whenever the conversation drifted too far from the properties. A quickness in the way she answered when I said I still wasn't ready to look at paperwork yet. I said that was thoughtful, that I would think about it. She squeezed my hand on the way out and told me I was strong. I stood at the window after her car left and noted that she had now mentioned the properties in both visits, and that the second mention came attached to Dwayne's name and a renovation idea. The document was one layer. This was the next note already forming underneath it. Between her visits, I was in Marlowe's office twice, signing documents, reviewing language. The trust structure was being prepared with the kind of precision that left nothing exposed. Every property correctly identified, every ownership interest correctly transferred, The irrevocable framework prepared carefully under Chapter 36C. Marlowe walked me through each page without rushing. The recording date was set for the end of the third week. On the afternoon of Simone's second visit, we sat across from each other over coffee. Her hand covered mine on the table. She talked about family and legacy, and how much she worried about me being alone in this house with so much to manage. Her voice was warm and patient and completely controlled. I thought about what it would look like to set the cup down and say what I knew. I let myself consider it fully: her face, the shift in the room, what she would do in the 10 seconds after I spoke. I understood it clearly. Confrontation without protection in place wasn't honesty. It was surrender. I would hand her everything she needed to accelerate and leave myself with nothing capable of stopping her, so I didn't. Not out of fear, not out of confusion. I looked at my daughter's hand covering mine, and I made a choice the way you make a real choice, with full understanding of what I was choosing and why. I nodded at something she said. I refilled her cup. Marlowe called on a Thursday morning. 4 words. That was all she said before I could speak. It has been recorded. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and didn't move for a while. I looked out the window at the yard, the same maple at the back corner that has stood there longer than I have lived in this house. The same uneven brick along the garden border. My husband always said he would fix, and never did. I used to look at that brick and feel the absence of him. That morning I looked at it differently. The Elm Grove and Patterson properties were no longer in my name. They sat inside an irrevocable trust, recorded permanently with the Guilford County Register of Deeds. The quitclaim deed Simone left on my kitchen table, the one she slid across to me with warm hands and careful words, was now a document pointing at an ownership structure that had ceased to exist. Whatever she had built her plan around was already gone. She just didn't know it yet. I thought about Harlan. Not the grief of him. I had been carrying that since the graveside, and it wasn't going anywhere. I thought about something specific. The morning I handed him that check and told him I believed in what he was building before anyone else did. I used to think of that as something I did for him. Sitting at that table, I understood for the first time that he had spent the rest of his life doing something for me. Quietly, without announcement, without ever asking me to know about it. He structured an entire life around honoring one morning I had almost forgotten. Simone called at 2 o'clock. Her voice was patient and warm, exactly as it always was. She asked if I had had more time to think. She mentioned that she and Dwayne had been talking to some contractors. Nothing committed, just preliminary conversations. She wanted me to know they were ready to move whenever I was. I told her my hands had been so unsteady that I was still not quite myself. She said, "Mama, take your time. I'm not going anywhere." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat for a moment with the phone on the table between my hands. She had said those exact words before. I'm not going anywhere. Each time she said them, they were designed to feel like comfort. What they actually were was patience. The particular patience of someone who has decided the outcome already and is simply waiting for the timing to align. She could wait as long as she wanted now. I picked up my keys. I drove to Marlowe's office without an appointment. The receptionist started to explain the schedule, and Marlowe came through the door before she finished. She looked at my face and stepped back to let me in. I sat down across from her and I said it plainly. I want to know everything that happens next, every step before it happens. I don't want to be informed after things are done. I want to understand exactly what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Marlowe looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded and reached for a file. We worked for 2 hours. When I walked out of that office, the sun was lower and the air had that particular coolness in the early evening. I drove home without the radio. I had stopped needing noise to fill the quiet. Simone arrived that Tuesday with a different quality of energy. Still warm, still attentive. But there was something underneath the warmth now. A direction, a forward lean in the way she sat down and set her bag on the chair beside her. Previous visits she had come to tend to me. This visit she had come to move something. She said she and Dwayne had been looking seriously at the properties. The market in Greensboro was strong and the timing was favorable. With targeted updates, kitchen finishes, bathroom fixtures, some exterior work on both Elm Grove and Patterson, the value could increase significantly before any decisions were made about next steps. She and Dwayne had contractor relationships they trusted. They could manage the entire process. It wouldn't cost me anything up front. Then she added something carefully. She said, if the paperwork was eventually finalized the way we had already discussed, it made more sense to renovate now, while contractor pricing was still reasonable. And interest rates hadn't shifted again by spring. Waiting another year could cost substantially more. Dwayne, she said, had already mapped out a phased schedule that minimized risk and upfront exposure. She said it the way she says most things, smoothly, with care wrapped around the edges of every word. I asked soft questions. I expressed gentle gratitude. I told her it meant a lot that she and Dwayne were thinking about these things. What I didn't tell her was that I had called Marlo before she arrived. I had described what Simone was likely to propose. Marlo was quiet for a moment on the other end. Then she said, say yes. Let them spend their money if they want to. Let Dwayne file every permit, every contract, every invoice, every permit application becomes part of a timeline showing what they believed these properties were eventually going to become. Say yes, and call me the moment they start. I said yes to Simone. Then I added one thing before she could move forward. I told her I wanted to put something in writing authorizing Dwayne to handle the permit process at the county office on my behalf. I said it simply. I didn't want any confusion about who had permission to act regarding the properties while the renovation work was underway. It would make things easier for everyone. Simone agreed without hesitation. She seemed genuinely pleased that I was thinking practically. That was the word she used. Practically. I wrote it out by hand and signed it before she left. Dwayne began pulling permits within the week. Contractors arrived at Elm Grove first. Equipment, materials. A crew that moved with organized efficiency. I watched them from the front window one morning, with my coffee going cold in my hand. I had a thought about Dwayne that I hadn't fully allowed myself before. He was not simply following his wife. A man who coordinates contractors, manages permit timelines, interfaces with county offices. He understood exactly what this renovation was positioned to accomplish. Maybe not legally, maybe not on paper yet, but in expectation, in intention. He had looked at those properties and calculated where all of this was supposed to end. He had made a choice, not once. Every morning, he showed up and directed that crew was another morning. He was choosing it again. I watched the crew work for another minute. Then I stepped back from the window and called Marlo. I told her the permits had started. She said she knew. The filings had already begun appearing through the county records system. She had been watching for them. I asked if everything was in order. She said, everything is exactly where it should be. Their names are attached to a renovation project on properties they expected to control eventually. Whether that expectation was reasonable or not is a separate matter entirely. But the timeline matters. The documentation matters. Let them keep building it. Then she said one more word before she ended the call. Good. I set the phone down and looked back out the window at the crew, working on a property that would never belong to the people who sent them there. Simone was in her element. I could see it the moment I arrived at Elm Grove. The way she moved through the space, decisive and unhurried simultaneously. The way a person moves when they feel completely at home in what they are doing. She had upgraded the kitchen finishes beyond what she initially described. Premium countertops were discussed. Refinished hardwood throughout. Fixtures that spoke to a particular buyer profile, not to a woman in her late 50s who had lived quietly and practically her entire life. She was not renovating this property for me. She walked me through every room with a pride that was completely genuine. That was the thing about Simone. Her confidence was never performed. It was real. She believed in what she was building here. She just had the wrong understanding of who she was building it for. Look at this kitchen, Mama. Look at these floors. She turned to face me with that particular brightness she carries when something is going exactly as she planned. This is going to be worth so much more when we're finished. I ran my hand along the new countertop. It's beautiful, baby. You've worked so hard. I watched her face receive that. The slight expansion. The satisfied nod. The immediate turn toward the next thing to show me. I understood her completely in that moment. Not with anger, not even with sadness. With the specific clarity that comes from watching someone perform for an audience that is no longer what they believe it to be. On the way out, I passed Dwayne in the hallway. He was looking at his phone. He glanced up when I came through the door, and something moved across his face before he could arrange it. Not guilt, something more precise than guilt. Awareness. He held my gaze for 1 second longer than was comfortable. Then he looked back at his phone. Neither of us spoke. But I had seen it. He knew I had seen it. And we both left that hallway, understanding something about the other that neither of us was going to say out loud. That evening, Dexter called. He had been coordinating quietly with the property manager at Oak Ridge. The mansion was being prepared. Utilities stabilized. A small household staff briefed on what was coming. Private arrangements made through channels that carried no connection to my name yet. He told me the property would be ready whenever I was. I told him I wasn't ready yet, that I would let him know. He didn't press. He simply said, "Whenever you are." After I ended the call, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what Marlo had told me 2 days prior. The matter she was documenting under NC General Statute 14112.2 was becoming complete. The quitclaim deed, the framing of it as protection paperwork, the preserved documentation from 4 years ago that Harlan transferred through Dexter into Marlo's files, the renovation timeline, the permits, the contractor payments, the assumptions Simone and Dwayne had operated under from the beginning. Each element on its own could be explained away. Together they formed a pattern that became harder and harder to dismiss as misunderstanding alone. Simone was at Elm Grove right now making decisions about staging. She was documenting expectations she believed would eventually become an authorship. Every contractor invoice and every permit filing placed another date on the timeline. Marlo was quietly assembling. I looked at the kitchen counter in my own house. Plain, familiar, unchanged. I didn't need new countertops. I was moving somewhere else entirely. Marvell had been holding 2 boxes of Harlan's personal things since the estate was organized. Letters, photographs, documents from the years before anything was certain. She called and asked if I was ready to go through them. I drove over on a Saturday morning. We sat on her living room floor the way we used to sit when we were young women with no furniture worth mentioning, going through things together without needing to explain ourselves. Old photographs passed between us. A program from a church revival in 1987. A receipt from the first piece of equipment Harlan ever purchased, folded so many times the creases had gone soft. After a while, Marvell got up to make lunch. I kept going. The envelope was at the bottom of the second box, my name on the front. Harlan's handwriting, the particular slant of it I would know anywhere. The envelope was unsealed. The letter inside had been folded and unfolded enough times that the paper had gone gentle at the creases. I sat very still for a moment before I read it. I learned later from Dexter that Harlan had given him the letter years ago with specific instructions. It was not part of the formal estate file. It sat in a sealed envelope in Dexter's private safe, separate from every legal document, with instructions to place it among Harlan's personal items to be passed to Marvell for safekeeping, so that it would reach me not through legal process, but through the hands of someone who loved us both. Harlan had thought about how I would find it. He wrote the letter the week after Dexter contained the power of attorney situation 4 years ago. He never sent it because he decided the containment was enough, that telling me served nothing when the threat was already handled. But he needed to say the words somewhere. So he wrote them and folded them and gave them to a man he trusted completely. The first part of the letter was specific. He named what Simone had attempted. He described what she presented to the bank and what she intended. He explained why he handled it without telling me, not to protect himself, but because he knew what that knowledge would do to me, and he refused to be the one to put it in my chest when he was still alive to carry it for me. He did not soften what she did. He did not offer reasons for it. He simply named it plainly and moved forward. Then the letter shifted. He wrote about the morning I handed him that check. He said he had thought about that morning more times than he could count, across more years than either of us had anticipated having. He said it was never the money. He said a man who has nothing and is told by someone who loves him that she believes in him anyway, that lands in a place money cannot reach. He said he built everything from that place. Every property, every contract, every decision about how to structure what he had and who it would protect. He said the mansion in Oak Ridge was not inheritance. It was not a transfer of wealth. It was the life I should have been living while I was busy believing in people who needed it more than they deserved. He signed it the way he always did. Just Harlan. I read it twice. I folded it carefully along every crease he had made. I placed it in my bag. Marvell came back with 2 plates and looked at my face and sat down without a word. We ate lunch in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to explain itself. Simone called on a Monday morning, with the energy of someone in a final approach. The renovation was in its last week. She talked about walkthroughs and staging timelines with the momentum of a woman who could already see the finish line from where she was standing. I listened and asked small questions and let her talk. Before she ended the call, she mentioned, casually, that once everything was wrapped up there would be some additional paperwork to sort through. Just formalities, she said, to put everything in the right place legally. Nothing complicated. She said it exactly the way she said the first document was just paperwork. I told her I understood. I told her I trusted her completely. She said she knew I did. Dexter picked me up that Thursday morning and drove me to Oak Ridge. 40 minutes. I watched Greensboro thin out behind us, the familiar streets giving way to wider roads, then a private drive I wouldn't have found without someone who knew where it was. The trees thickened on both sides. Then the property came into view. I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked at what Harlan had built and held, and kept entirely to himself for 9 years, and I did not cry. I was past that. What moved through me standing at that car door was older than grief and quieter than gratitude. It was something that didn't have a clean name. Dexter stayed near the entrance while I walked through alone. The halls were wide and unhurried. The rooms furnished and ready, as though the house had been waiting without impatience. I moved through each space slowly, touching walls the way I touched Harlan's letter. Carefully, like the thing under my hands was real and I was still adjusting to that reality. I found a window that looked out over the full property. The grounds stretched toward a tree line at the far edge. The sky had gone gray in the late afternoon, the way it does in October in North Carolina, that particular gray that feels like the world is settling rather than ending. I stood there and understood what Harlan saw from this window. What he was working toward every year, he added another property to the portfolio. Every decision he made about how to structure and protect what he had built. He saw this. He saw me standing here. He planned for this moment from a distance I hadn't known to measure. I turned and found Dexter in the doorway. I said, "I'm ready to come here." "Not yet. But I'm ready." He nodded once. That was enough. Marlowe called that evening. The matter involving Simone and Dwayne was fully documented. Every element organized and ready to move the moment I gave her the word. I told her, "Not yet. Let them finish the renovation. Let Simone arrive with the next set of documents. I want them to complete everything they started before anything moves." Then I asked her the one thing I needed to know before I could be fully still about it. I asked whether Simone's attorney could find any vulnerability in the trust. Anything challengeable. Marlowe was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A determined attorney can challenge almost anything on paper. But this trust was prepared carefully under Chapter 36C, properly executed, properly witnessed, properly recorded. There is no credible basis to undo it. If they pursue it, they will spend money and time and come back with nothing useful. The trust is clean." I exhaled slowly. I said, "Then we wait." Both properties were finished. I had driven past Elm Grove the morning after the final walkthrough. The exterior work was clean. The landscaping deliberate. Everything about it said, "This is ready." Not for a woman who had lived quietly in Greensboro for 30 years. For a listing. Simone arrived at my door 3 days later, dressed the way she dresses when she wants to be taken seriously. She had a folder, different from the first one, thicker, with a professional edge to it. She sat down at the same kitchen table. Where she sat the afternoon, she brought the quitclaim deed, and she opened it with the ease of a woman who believes she is one signature away from the end of a very long plan. She began to explain. Her voice was warm and professional in equal measure. She had the language prepared, the same careful framing, the same architecture of concern dressed as paperwork. She was almost rehearsed. Almost. I let her finish completely. Then I said, "Before we go any further with this, I think you should call your attorney." She stopped. She looked at me across the table with an expression that hadn't had time to arrange itself. Yet, I told her, "The Elm Grove and Patterson properties are no longer in my name directly. They were transferred into an irrevocable trust several weeks ago, recorded with the Guilford County Register of Deeds. You can verify it with a simple search." The room changed. She did not react immediately. That was the thing I noted. She did not react immediately. Her hands, which had been resting open on the folder, closed slowly, not into fists, just into stillness. Her jaw set by a degree that someone who didn't know her face wouldn't have caught. She blinked once, twice. Her eyes moved away. Eyes move when a mind is running very fast and the body has been instructed to hold. She was looking for the angle that made this not what it was. That took approximately 30 seconds. Then the warmth left her face entirely, not gradually, but the way a light goes when the power cuts, and the questions came fast and sharp. When did you do this? Who helped you with this? Why didn't you tell me you were speaking to someone? Why would you do something like this without telling me first? I looked at my daughter across the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I let a moment pass before I answered. I said, I had some help with it. It's been done properly. You should call your attorney, Simone. She looked at me for a long time after that. I held her gaze without difficulty. There was nothing left in her expression that resembled the woman who had walked through my door with food and patience and warm hands for the past several weeks. What was there instead was something stripped down and unguarded that I recognized as the truth of her. She gathered the folder. She stood. She walked to the door. She did not say goodbye. I sat at the table after the door closed and did not move for a long time. I listened to the quiet settle back into the house. I thought about nothing specific. I let the moment be what it was. Then I picked up my phone. I called Marlo and said 2 words. Do it. Simone retained an attorney within 48 hours. I knew because Marlo told me. She received the first inquiry call before the week was out. A formal request for documentation, professional in tone, careful in its language. Simone's attorney was thorough. He examined the trust from every available angle. Proper execution, proper witnessing, proper recording with the Guilford County Register of Deeds. Every inquiry returned the same result. Marlo let the examination run its course. She did not rush her response. She waited until Simone's attorney had finished looking and found nothing substantial before she sent her first formal correspondence to his office. I did not see the letter. I didn't need to. Marlo walked me through it the morning she sent it. It was precise and thorough in the way Marlo does everything. It documented the quitclaim deed, the instrument itself, the visit, the framing of it as protective paperwork to a woman 3 days removed from her brother's funeral. It documented the power of attorney attempt 4 years prior. The document Simone drafted, the bank approach, the attempt to add her name to one of my accounts while I was recovering from surgery, the compliance review that halted the process before any change occurred. Every page Harlan preserved, and Dexter transferred to Marlo's files. It documented the renovation permits Dwayne filed on properties he carried no ownership interest in, along with the financial investments both he and Simone made while operating under assumptions Marlo characterized carefully and in full. Then the letter shifted direction, not toward accusations, toward exposure, potential financial exploitation concerns, potential fraud implications, a documented pattern that, at minimum, created sufficient concern to justify civil action and possible review by the appropriate authorities if the matter continued escalating. Marlo told me Simone's attorney went quiet after that. The kind of quiet that means a conversation has changed direction permanently. Dwayne received his own copy at his office address. Marlo told me he read it in his car, that he sat there nearly 40 minutes before he went inside. By the end of that week, something had fractured between them that I suspected could not be repaired by anything available to either of them. There were 2 attorneys now, not one shared between them, but 2 separate representations, with 2 separate sets of advice running in 2 separate directions. The unit that had moved so seamlessly together from the day they arrived at my door with that folder was no longer a unit in the way it had been. The renovation investment was gone. Every dollar they spent on countertops and fixtures and contractor labor sat inside my irrevocable trust, with no legal mechanism requiring reimbursement. Whatever they believed they were building no longer belonged to them in any way they could reach. I didn't hear from Simone directly. What I heard came from other directions entirely. The contractor who worked Elm Grove mentioned to someone in his church congregation that the job had felt strange from the beginning. The daughter ran everything. The mother was rarely present. And then suddenly there were lawyers involved and the job was just done. That moved the way things move in a community like ours. Quietly, from one person to the next, gathering weight as it traveled. The neighbor on Patterson Street noticed that Dwayne's truck had stopped coming. She asked me about it when she saw me getting my mail. I told her I'd had some legal matters to sort out, that everything was handled. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they already know more than they're letting on. Someone from my church asked me the same question 3 days later. I gave her the same answer, word for word. I had some legal matters to sort out. Everything is handled. I said nothing else to anyone. I didn't need to. The truth was already moving on its own. The legal process requires disclosure. That was what Marlo explained to me. Once of the civil filings and supporting documentation reached the stage where my financial structure had to be fully established. Not because I chose to reveal anything. Because the attorneys involved needed a complete accounting of the assets connected to the properties and trusts Simone had attempted to position herself around. Every holding, every structure Harlan built and left in my name. The documents were thorough. Tyron Holdings, LLC, the Oak Ridge Mansion, the commercial real estate portfolio across Guilford County, Alamance, and Forsyth, the construction company sale proceeds held inside the trust. The full estate value, $120 million, entered the legal record without ceremony, without announcement, the way facts enter a room when there is no longer any reason to keep them out. Simone found out through her attorney. Not from me, not from a phone call, not from a conversation at any kitchen table. Her attorney placed the disclosure documents in front of her in his office and asked her to review them. I was not there. I did not need to be. Marlo told me what she heard through professional channels, that Simone's attorney had requested a recess, that Simone had sat with those documents for a long time before she said anything at all. I thought about what that moment must have looked like. A woman who had spent 11 years working real estate transactions in Guilford County, North Carolina. A woman who knew property values the way other people know their own street, who understood market corridors and assessed valuations and LLC structures and deed records, who had built her entire plan on the assumption that she knew exactly what her mother had and exactly what she was moving toward. The Oak Ridge Mansion had been held under Tyron Holdings, LLC, for 9 years. One of several layered holding entities Harlan used to separate personal life from business assets. No public branding. No visible connection to his residential address. Most of the portfolio operated through private leasing relationships and quiet institutional partnerships that kept his name almost entirely outside public attention. Simone had worked in the same county for years. She had never once connected any of it back to Harlan, never pulled the right thread, never found the right name, never understood the scale of what sat outside the small circle of properties she believed represented my entire life. She came for 2 properties on Elm Grove and Patterson with a quitclaim deed. Her mother had been sitting on $120 million. Marlo sold the Greensboro properties that same week, both of them. The renovation Simone designed, Dwayne coordinated, and they jointly funded had increased the market value on both addresses beyond what either property would have commanded untouched. The closings were clean and efficient. Every dollar of that appreciation moved directly into my trust. Marlo handled it with the same precision she had brought to every step of this. I was packing when she called to confirm the sales had closed. I hadn't planned to take much. Some photographs from the hallway. My husband, Harlan Young. A picture of Marvell and me from a church trip in 1994 that I have never been able to leave behind. My husband's Bible from the nightstand. The letter from Harlan, already in my bag since the Saturday I found it. A few things from the kitchen. A cast iron skillet. A wooden spoon worn smooth on one side from 30 years of use. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked at what I was leaving. The furniture. The curtains I'd hung after my husband died because I needed something in the house to change. The uneven brick in the garden that never got fixed. I was not sentimental about any of it. I was ready for what was ahead. I walked through the Greensboro house one last time alone. I did it slowly. No ceremony, no particular order. I let each room be what it was. A decade or more of living compressed into walls that had absorbed everything and given nothing back except shelter, which was enough, which had always been enough. I stood in the kitchen last. I looked at the table. I looked at the doorframe across from it. The exact place I was standing when my mouth was already opening. when I was about to give Simone the only thing inside that terrible day that wasn't loss. I stood there and let myself see it clearly one final time, not with bitterness, with the particular understanding that comes when you can finally see the full shape of something that was too close to see before. I picked up my bag. I walked out. I did not look back at the house from the car. Dexter was waiting at the end of the Oak Ridge Drive when I arrived. Marvell was already inside. She had come an hour early, the way she does everything, the way she has done everything for as long as I have known her. The house was warm. Late afternoon light came through the tall windows and lay itself across the floors in long, quiet panels. I walked through it differently than I had the first time. The first time it felt like Harlan's house, like I was a visitor standing inside someone else's life, trying to understand how I fit into it. This time, every room received me like a thing that had been waiting without impatience and was simply glad the waiting was done. I found the window, the same one I had stood at in October, the grounds, the tree line at the far edge, the sky going still above it. I stood there for a long time without needing to move. Simone and Dwayne were still inside the legal proceedings under NC General Statute 14112.2. The case was moving through its proper stages. Nothing had closed and nothing would close quickly. That process belonged to Marlowe and the courts and whatever time it required. It was no longer mine to carry or watch or think about before I slept. The community that watched me grieve had watched everything else assemble itself the way truth assembles in places where people pay attention, in pieces, through quiet conversations, through the slow recognition that something which looked one way was always something else. The Tyrone name had shifted in meaning, not just Harlan's work, not just what he built, what I survived, what I arrived at. I looked down at my hands on the window sill. They were still, completely still. For the first time since I stood at Harlan's grave offside in the January cold and felt the world reorganize itself around his absence, my hands were not shaking. I thought about what Simone saw when she sat across from me at that kitchen table with her folder and her warm voice and her careful words. A grieving widow, unsteady, unprotected. A woman whose hands shook when she tried to read a document her own daughter had slid toward her. I thought about what those hands had actually done. The check written from savings that weren't much, but were everything I had at the time. The documents signed in Marlowe's office on mornings Simone believed I was barely keeping myself together. The phone set down after every call without saying the one thing I knew. I thought about what those hands built before anyone thought to look, and what they protected while everyone was watching something else entirely. I straightened. I stepped back from the window. She came for a widow with shaky hands. She never once considered what those hands had already built.